The Night the Laughter Stopped Las Vegas, 1967. The Sands showroom shimmered under chandeliers that had witnessed 1,000 standing ovations and twice as many whispered betrayals. 300 people filled the velvet seats that night, diamonds catching stage light, cigarette smoke rising like ghosts above crystal glasses. It was supposed to be another legendary reunion, the kind that kept the Rat Pack mythology alive long after the jokes had grown familiar. When Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin walked onto that stage together, history usually bent around them. But this night carried something heavier than nostalgia. It carried suspicion, pride, and a wound neither man had yet named. Dean had arrived early, as he always did. Contrary to the image he performed so effortlessly, he was methodical. He pressed his tuxedo himself. Then he reviewed the set list. He warmed up quietly, humming scales with the calm of a man who knew the difference between character and craft. The drunk persona audiences adored had never been more than theater, a looseness carefully constructed, a wink disguised as chaos. Off stage, Dean was deliberate, observant, and far more sober in spirit than most men in the building. Frank arrived later, electric and volatile. Those who worked around him recognized the signs immediately. Clipped sentences, restless pacing, a temper barely leashed. He had been at war with management for weeks, convinced betrayal hid in every handshake. Rumors had reached him, whispers that Dean might stay at the Sands if he left, that Dean might carve out independence, that Dean no longer needed him. Fear, when it visits powerful men, rarely introduces itself as fear. It arrives disguised as anger. The show began with applause thunderous enough to mask tension. They opened smoothly, harmonies intact, timing precise. The audience saw only polish. They did not see the glances exchanged beneath the lights. Frank's searching, Dean's steady restraint. The first half unfolded as expected. Laughter, improvisation, the comfortable rhythm of two icons who had shared decades of stages and secrets. Then came the pivot. Between songs, Frank leaned toward the microphone with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He began teasing Dean about drinking, at first in the familiar cadence of their routine. The audience laughed, relieved to recognize the old pattern, but the jokes sharpened. The tone shifted. What began as performance slipped toward accusation. But Frank's voice lost its playful edge and acquired something raw. He suggested that Dean's act wasn't an act at all, that the glass was not theater but necessity, that professionalism had been masked by charm. The laughter faltered. Dean did not interrupt immediately. He stood there, hands in his pockets, gaze level. He understood stages. He understood timing. Most of all, he understood dignity. When Frank pushed further, crossing from humor into humiliation, something in the room changed. Even the band felt it. Dean stepped forward and gently took the microphone. His voice was calm, not defensive, not wounded, calm in a way that unsettled the air. He acknowledged the joke first. Then he separated the joke from the man. He explained that characters can grow so convincing they eclipse their creators, that audiences sometimes prefer illusion to truth. He clarified, without aggression, that craft is not addiction, that performance is not pathology. He did not attack Frank. He did not retaliate. He simply stood in clarity, and clarity is a powerful weapon. Then he asked Frank one question in front of everyone. Why? It was not shouted. It was not theatrical. It was sincere. Why had a friend of 20 years chosen suspicion over conversation? Why had insecurity been allowed to dress itself as spectacle? Why had loyalty not been granted the courtesy of trust? The room fell utterly silent. Frank, who could command any audience with a glance, found himself without script. Anger evaporated, leaving something far less comfortable: exposure. Beneath the bravado stood a man who feared being left behind, who feared irrelevance. and who feared that Dean's independence meant abandonment. Dean did not exploit the moment. He could have. Instead, he offered perspective. He reminded Frank and the audience that strength does not require diminishing others, that friendship cannot survive public trials without private honesty, that power wielded carelessly wounds both parties. There was no shouting match, no thrown punches, no melodrama, just two men confronting the fragile truth beneath ego. Frank apologized, not theatrically, not as performance, but haltingly, visibly aware he had misjudged both rumor and friend. The apology did not restore the easy chemistry of earlier that night. It did something more important. It acknowledged fault. They finished the show professionally, though something irrevocable had shifted. The audience applauded politely, unsure whether they had witnessed entertainment or confession. Backstage, they did not speak immediately. Some friendships fracture loudly, others crack in near silence. That night, beneath the glamour of Las Vegas, the mythology of two icons gave way to something more human: insecurity, pride, and the difficult beginning of accountability. The headlines the next morning focused on the confrontation. What they did not capture was the deeper shift, the moment when performance ended and character, real character, began. And this was only the beginning. The cost of ego. The morning after the confrontation did not arrive gently. Las Vegas sunlight has a way of exposing everything it touches, stripping glamour from the night before and leaving only consequence. Inside the sands, whispers traveled faster than room service trays. Journalists who had attended the show filed carefully worded columns, avoiding scandal but hinting at tension. Those who had been present could not quite describe what they had seen, only that something sacred between two legends had fractured under stage lights. The public would remember the headline. The industry would remember the silence that followed it. Dean Martin woke earlier than usual that morning, not because he had slept poorly, but because his mind refused to quiet itself. He replayed the moment when the laughter died, when humor had curdled into accusation. He had spent decades mastering detachment, cultivating an image that suggested nothing truly bothered him. Yet that night had cut deeper than he expected. It was not the word itself that lingered. It was the source. When criticism comes from strangers, and it rarely penetrates, when it comes from someone who knows your history, your insecurities, your private doubts, it carries weight. Across town, Frank Sinatra stared at a hotel ceiling he had not slept beneath so restlessly in years. Pride is an unyielding companion, but even pride knows when it has miscalculated. In the privacy of early morning, without applause to feed it, ego shrinks to its true size. Frank had not intended to dismantle his friend publicly. What he had intended was to reassert control, to puncture what he perceived as distance growing between them. The rumor that Dean might pursue independence had struck something vulnerable inside him, something he had never admitted aloud, that Dean's calm self-sufficiency unsettled him. Dean did not need chaos to thrive. Dean did not need dominance to command respect. Now that quiet strength felt foreign, even threatening. By midday, casino executives were already attempting damage control. They framed the confrontation as theatrical banter gone slightly too far, a misunderstanding amplified by stage lights. Public relations specialists drafted statements emphasizing friendship, mutual respect, decades of collaboration. The machine of entertainment is efficient at smoothing surfaces. What it cannot repair as easily is trust. Dean declined interviews that week. He performed his scheduled shows with professional polish, but those who knew him well sensed a subtle shift. The onstage drunk persona softened, became less exaggerated, almost reflective. It was as if he no longer wished to blur lines between act and identity. The caricature had been weaponized once. He would not allow it again. Off stage, he withdrew slightly from the orbit that had long defined him. He spent more evenings at home, more time in quiet rooms where applause could not distort perspective. Frank, meanwhile, attempted reconciliation the only way he initially understood, through grand gestures. He sent messages, flowers, offers to meet, invitations to private dinners. Yet each gesture carried traces of urgency rather than humility. Dean responded politely but without haste. Forgiveness, he knew, cannot be rushed into existence. It requires reflection from both sides, not simply apology from one. Industry figures began choosing sides in private conversations. Some sympathized with Frank's volatility, interpreting it as the burden of leadership. Others quietly admired Dean's composure, noting that restraint often reveals greater authority than volume ever could. And within weeks, an unexpected narrative took shape. For years, Dean had been perceived as the relaxed counterpart, the one content to harmonize rather than dominate. Now observers began to reassess. They saw discipline beneath ease, steadiness beneath humor. The confrontation had inadvertently illuminated the difference between charisma fueled by fire and charisma grounded in calm. Eventually, the two men met privately, without handlers, without an audience. The meeting was not dramatic. No raised voices, no theatrical embraces. Instead, it unfolded slowly, like two seasoned fighters lowering their gloves after recognizing that the real opponent had been pride itself. Frank spoke first, not with bravado but with admission. He acknowledged that fear of abandonment had driven his words, that rumors had been convenient catalysts for deeper insecurity. He confessed that watching Dean flourish independently unsettled him because it forced him to confront his own dependence on partnership. Dean listened more than he spoke. When he did respond, his words were measured. He explained that friendship built on equality cannot survive public humiliation, that loyalty demands consultation before accusation, that love, even between men accustomed to dominance, requires vulnerability. He did not demand submission. He demanded accountability. The conversation did not resolve everything in one sitting. Healing rarely does. Yet something essential shifted. The balance of power recalibrated. Frank recognized that influence does not exempt one from responsibility. Dean recognized that setting boundaries is not betrayal but preservation. And they agreed that if they were to continue performing together, it would be as separate stars choosing collaboration, not as extensions of one another's identity. In the months that followed, their joint appearances resumed cautiously. Audiences still felt the spark, but beneath the humor lay a newfound respect. The jokes returned, though sharper edges were avoided. When Dean leaned into his familiar persona, it carried an unmistakable wink, a reminder that performance is choice, not confession. When Frank introduced him on stage, there was an added layer of sincerity, a visible acknowledgement of equality. The cost of ego had been steep. Headlines had circulated. Doubts had flickered. Yet the confrontation had forced both men to confront truths long deferred. For Frank, it meant accepting that power does not entitle one to public dominance over private bonds. For Dean, it meant recognizing that silence in the face of humiliation can preserve peace but erode self-respect. The night that could have ended their friendship instead exposed the fault lines that required repair. In quieter conversations later, industry veterans would say that the incident marked a turning point. Not in their careers, both remained giants in their own right, but in their maturity. They no longer performed partnership out of habit, they chose it deliberately. And choice, unlike assumption, carries weight. The public remembered the accusation. Those closer to the story remembered the aftermath, the restraint, the difficult admissions, the recalibration of two formidable personalities learning that loyalty is not automatic. It must be maintained, defended, and sometimes rebuilt from bruised pride. What began as humiliation became revelation, and revelation, though painful, often strengthens foundations that complacency leaves weak. The work of forgiveness. Time has a way of cooling headlines, but intensifying private reflection. In the months following the confrontation, the noise around Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin softened publicly, yet internally both men were navigating a quieter and far more demanding reckoning. What had occurred on that stage was not merely a public embarrassment. It had exposed the architecture of their friendship, revealing where ego had reinforced it and where trust had weakened it. The real work now was not salvaging image, it was rebuilding foundation. Dean approached forgiveness the way he approached performance, patiently and deliberately, without theatrics. He understood that anger can feel righteous, but rarely produces clarity. Still, he did not confuse calmness with passivity. He had drawn a line that night, and he would not erase it simply to restore comfort. In the weeks that followed, he maintained distance not out of vengeance but out of necessity. Forgiveness, he believed, requires proof of change, not simply apology. It requires behavior that aligns with regret. Frank, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, confronted a situation that charm and influence could not immediately repair. He had spent decades commanding rooms, bending situations to his will, smoothing over conflicts with intensity and magnetism. But this time, Dean had responded not with fury but with composed truth. That response lingered in Frank's mind. It left no opening for counterattack. It left only the uncomfortable mirror of accountability. In private conversations with trusted friends, Frank admitted something he had long avoided acknowledging, that he feared irrelevance more than failure. Watching Dean cultivate independence, headline solo engagements, and earn respect without theatrics unsettled him. Dean's ease, his refusal to compete aggressively, had once felt reassuring. Now it felt threatening because it suggested that power did not need to dominate to endure. Frank began to realize that what he had interpreted as distance was actually growth. Meanwhile, Dean found himself reflecting on the complexity of their bond. Their friendship had been forged in shared struggle, reinforced by shared success and tested by shared ego. For years, they had operated within an unspoken hierarchy that suited them both. Frank, the firebrand leader. Dean, the understated equalizer. The confrontation had disrupted that balance, not because one had gained superiority, but because one had demanded parity. They met again privately several weeks later, not at a casino or a studio, but at a quiet home far from press. The conversation that unfolded was neither explosive nor sentimental. It was layered, deliberate, and at times uncomfortable. Frank acknowledged that he had allowed insecurity to override loyalty. Dean acknowledged that he had perhaps underestimated how deeply partnership defined Frank's sense of identity. They spoke not as performers, but as men aging within an industry that rarely tolerated vulnerability. Dean articulated something that would remain central to their renewed bond. Friendship is not measured by how often you stand together in public, but by how you protect one another when no one is watching. He explained that public humiliation, even when retracted, leaves residue. It plants doubt not only in others, but within oneself. He did not accuse Frank further. He simply described the emotional cost. Frank listened without interruption. That in itself was change. Forgiveness did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived gradually through consistency. Frank began demonstrating restraint in public spaces, ensuring that humor remained humor and never edged toward exposure. He consulted Dean before major decisions affecting their shared appearances. He resisted the urge to test boundaries with barbed improvisation. And these were subtle adjustments, but they mattered. They signaled that apology had matured into awareness. Dean, in turn, allowed warmth to return slowly. He did not erase memory of the hurt, but he ceased allowing it to dominate the present. When they performed together again, the chemistry evolved. The dynamic shifted from rivalry laced with tension to collaboration grounded in mutual recognition. The audience sensed something different, but could not always name it. The laughter felt less competitive, the harmonies more balanced. Industry observers noted that Dean's public identity strengthened after the incident. He was no longer perceived solely as the relaxed counterpart in a powerful duo. He emerged as an independent force whose restraint revealed authority. Frank, too, experienced transformation. He became more reflective in interviews, more measured when discussing loyalty and partnership. Though he never fully relinquished his intensity, it became tempered by awareness that even charisma has limits when it disregards trust. The true test of forgiveness came not in grand gestures but in ordinary moments. A delayed rehearsal that could have sparked irritation was handled with patience. A rumor surfaced about contract negotiations. Instead of reacting impulsively, Frank called Dean directly. These small choices, repeated over time, rebuilt credibility. Trust, once cracked, does not regenerate instantly. It grows layer by layer through evidence of reliability. Years later, when both men had weathered further storms in their respective careers, they would occasionally reflect on that night as a turning point rather than a catastrophe. It had forced them to articulate expectations previously left unsaid. It had clarified that loyalty requires dialogue before assumption. It had revealed that even the strongest partnerships are vulnerable when pride overrides perspective. Forgiveness, they learned, is not a declaration, but a practice. It is the daily decision to treat past hurt as lesson rather than weapon. It demands humility from the one who erred and discernment from the one who was wounded. In choosing to continue their friendship, they did not erase what had happened. They incorporated it into a more honest foundation. What made their reconciliation enduring was not nostalgia for shared glory, but commitment to growth. They accepted that maturity does not eliminate conflict. It transforms how conflict is navigated. By confronting insecurity directly rather than disguising it as humor, they preserved something more valuable than image: authenticity. The public would always remember the headline. What endured between them was quieter and far more profound: the knowledge that they had faced the fracture honestly and chosen repair over pride. In that choice lay the true measure of resilience. Legacy, beyond the spotlight time, does something to men who have lived loudly. It softens the sharpest edges and strips away the noise until only essence remains. In the years that followed the confrontation between Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra, their careers continued to evolve, their individual identities becoming more defined than ever before. They still shared stages occasionally, and still traded barbs that made audiences roar with laughter, but the foundation beneath those performances had changed. It was no longer built on assumption or dominance. It was built on earned respect. What the public saw as effortless chemistry was, in truth, the product of difficult conversations and deliberate growth. As the 1970s unfolded, both men faced the inevitable transition from cultural lightning rods to elder statesmen of entertainment. The industry that once revolved around their presence began shifting toward new faces and new sounds. For many performers, this transition breeds bitterness. For them, it brought perspective. They had survived rivalry, ego, betrayal, and reconciliation. They understood something younger stars often learn too late: that legacy is not measured by applause alone, but by the relationships that outlast it. In quieter interviews, when asked about longevity, Dean would sometimes smile and speak about balance. He rarely referenced the incident directly, but those who knew him understood its influence. He spoke about the importance of separating persona from identity, of never allowing public narrative to define private truth. The drunk character that once dominated his stage presence gradually softened into nostalgia rather than caricature. He became more openly reflective, occasionally discussing discipline behind the illusion. In doing so, he reclaimed authorship over his image. The narrative that had once been threatened was now fully his again. Frank, too, matured publicly. Though he remained passionate and occasionally volatile, there was a discernible shift in how he navigated partnerships. He demonstrated greater caution before allowing rumor to influence reaction. He consulted rather than confronted. Those closest to him observed that the 1967 rupture had imprinted itself deeply. It had shown him that even the strongest friendships could fracture under ego's weight. He carried that lesson forward, sometimes imperfectly, but consciously. Their later collaborations carried an undercurrent of gratitude. When they performed classics together, the harmonies were seasoned not only by years of practice, but by forgiveness. Audiences sensed something unspoken between them, a depth that went beyond showmanship. They laughed at the jokes, applauded the songs, and perhaps unknowingly witnessed the product of resilience. There is a particular richness in friendship that has endured trial. It hums beneath every shared glance. As age advanced and health inevitably declined, reflection grew more frequent. Both men had built empires of sound and style. Yet in private moments, what mattered most was not chart positions or box office numbers. It was the knowledge that, when tested, they had chosen repair over rupture. That choice defined them more profoundly than any record ever could. When Dean passed away in 1995, the entertainment world mourned the loss of an icon. Yet within that grief was something quieter and more personal for Frank. Those who observed him during that period described a man altered by absence. Fame provides many companions, but genuine friendship is rare currency. The bond forged over decades, tested publicly and privately, had become part of his internal compass. Without it, something essential felt displaced. Years later, when Frank himself left the world in 1998, retrospectives celebrated his monumental career. Among tributes and recordings, the narrative of his friendship with Dean resurfaced not as scandal, but as testament. Commentators revisited their dynamic, often romanticizing the Rat Pack era. Yet those who understood the deeper story knew that what endured was not mythology, but maturity. They had confronted insecurity, acknowledged fault, and rebuilt trust. That arc gave their partnership dimension beyond performance. The confrontation that once threatened to unravel them ultimately strengthened their legacy. It revealed that even legends wrestle with doubt, that even powerful men must answer for careless words. More importantly, it demonstrated that accountability need not destroy connection, it can refine it. Their story became less about rivalry and more about the courage required to confront one's own flaws. In the end, what remains of any public figure is not the rumor or the headline, but the pattern of their choices. Dean chose dignity in the face of humiliation. Frank chose humility in the face of error. Together, they chose forgiveness over fracture. That sequence of decisions transformed a volatile moment into a defining chapter of resilience. Long after the lights dimmed and the casinos changed ownership, recordings of their voices continued to circulate, intertwined in harmony. Listeners who knew nothing of backstage tension still felt authenticity in those harmonies. Perhaps authenticity survives because it has been tested. Perhaps friendship that has endured fracture carries a depth that performance alone cannot simulate. The story of that night in 1967 does not endure because of accusation. It endures because of response. It endures because one man answered humiliation with composure and another answered correction with humility. It endures because two giants of entertainment proved that pride, though powerful, is not stronger than loyalty consciously chosen. Legacies are often polished to remove imperfections. Theirs retained the scar, and in that scar lay truth. They were not flawless men. They were complex, ambitious, occasionally insecure. But they were also capable of growth. And growth, especially among those accustomed to dominance, is perhaps the rarest strength of all. In remembering them, one might recall the laughter, the suits, the swagger. Yet beneath all that spectacle lies something quieter and far more enduring. A friendship tested by ego and preserved by forgiveness. That is the story that outlived them. That is the harmony that never faded.